But first, let me just say to this group, the work and the commitment that all of you are doing to make DuPage and the western suburbs a better place is absolutely commendable. I know there's days where it doesn't feel like you're getting the recognition that you deserve, but people like me really understand the importance of what you guys are doing, and the commitment and the effort and the putting it together by a shoestring. I understand the challenge there. So let me tell you who I am. So Curtis Reed, my official title is Region Manager, Managing Director, JPMorgan Chase. I run our middle market banking business for Illinois. It's a $1 billion business. I also am part of our broader market leadership team. We have 14,000 employees in the Illinois region. And as part of that leadership team, I have 3 principal goals. Business, how do we make sure all of our lines of business are operating together cohesively in order to drive business for the bank? People, 14,000 employees, how do we engage with our employees, empower them, give them the opportunities to continue to grow within our business and in the community, and then lastly, community. How can we continue to be a pillar of the community? We've been in Chicago for 200 years. Abraham Lincoln literally signed our charter. It wasn't Chase, it was first Chicago. But we've been here since and deeply committed into the community. And I'll talk way more about that in terms of the things that we're doing and the commitments. But first, let me just tell you about myself, my journey. I'm not really shy in front of getting in front of people in groups, but I'm pretty shy about my personal life. And it wasn't until after George Floyd that I decided I need to make sure I share my story because it's important and it resonates with many people in terms of when we look at what's happening today, a lot of times we don't have full context and understanding. So it's always good to understand not just where someone is, but where they came from and understanding that journey. So my journey started, there's several stories, and I'll be honest, my story is not unique. If you're an African American in this country, very similar stories can be told. One story I'm going to tell is about Fred Logan, probably born late 1800s in Starkville, Mississippi. Born in a barn, born in secrecy. His mother was a former slave. His father was a former slaveholder, and his birth was not consensual. He was hidden in a barn for most of his early life. In fact, he struggled to speak and to communicate for years. He later had 8 children. One of those boys was Raymond Logan. He later met a woman, my grandmother, who has since passed. At the age of 15, she had a young child named Curtis Reed, Sr. That was in 1950, born in Starkville, Mississippi. So the world that my dad grew up in is much different than the world is that I grew up in or we all live in today. He grew up in Jim Crow South. So the stories that he tells me is, if you were walking on a sidewalk and there was a white woman walking down the street, he knew he had to go to the other side of the street. If there was a drinking fountain, he knew that he drank out of the colored drinking fountain. If they went to the movies, if they actually had the chance to go to the movies because they didn't have any money, he knew that he had to enter through the back and they had to go up into the balcony. So he couldn't sit down with everyone else. If you got on a bus, which again, if you could afford to get on a bus because they didn't really have any money, he'd walk everywhere, he knew he had to get in the back of the bus. And he knew that every time a car behind him pulled up, there was always a likelihood that he could disappear. Because many young black people in general, would sometimes just disappear. So he grew up in this state. And to add to it, he had a very unstable home life. So my grandfather, who I only met once, That's Raymond, I mentioned his name. Wasn't part of my dad's life. So my grandmother married someone else, had kids. It was a very abusive upbringing. And so at the age of 15, which just blows my mind because I have a 15-year-old daughter, sophomore at Hinsdale Central High School. At the age of 15, he left home. Went to East St. Louis to stay with his uncle and his cousins. Life didn't get any easier from there. But there was something in my dad, which I'll share later, that he instilled in me, that I know helped him through a lot of challenges. Working several jobs. People were telling him, why are you going to college? Why would you even consider going to college? You need to work. He did work. He worked so he can go to college. First to go to college, went to Southern Illinois University, where he met my mother, Doris Reed. I was born in college. I believe my parents were just finishing up their senior year, so I was born in Carbondale, Illinois, actually Murfreesboro, Illinois. And then they graduated. My dad continued to work hard, and he got into kind of the television business, but it was as one of those stagehands, you know, the people in the background with the camera, and they're telling them time to go on, and click the light. Worked his way up in St. Louis to the sales office, where he started selling advertising for commercials for the station. Later, continued to transition. He got transferred to Cleveland, so we moved to Cleveland when I was like 5 years old. My sister was born. I have one sister, her name's Kylie. We lived in Cleveland only for a few years, and then he was transferred to Chicago, where he was only supposed to be here for a little bit on his way to New York. A little bit turned to 42 years later. So I moved here when I was 7. That was in 1979. I didn't know at the time, but just like he's done all his life, my dad said, I want to go somewhere where we have good education, safety, great place for my kids to grow up, just like everybody wants, right? The unfortunate thing in Chicago, and Chicago has a deep-rooted, unfortunate history of intentional segregation. We don't have the South and West sides the way we do today because it was just by chance. We could talk about redlining, we could talk about all the different things. So what he told me later was they had to get 3 different realtors before they could find one that would sell them a home in Naperville. Naperville at the time was probably 10, 12,000 people, largely a farm town. Definitely no blacks. If there were, it was only several, or any other really diversity. But they had to go through 3 realtors before one would agree to sell them a home there. They wanted them to live in a black area. So, grew up in Naperville, and this is where the story starts to change. I will tell you, I had a fantastic upbringing. I was afforded every opportunity available. All the things that my dad and my mother wanted were afforded to me. Good education, sports, safety. The only thing is I was always the only one. Hardly ever did I see anyone, unless I went to my family's house in south side of Chicago or Mississippi, to see someone like me. So that part was a little bit different. I'll get to that in a minute. But went to University of Iowa. Actually, I wanted to be a baseball player or an football player. I was actually pretty good. I got a scholarship to University of Iowa to play baseball. Played all 4 years there. Unfortunately, had a shoulder injury, which briefly cut that dream short. Then I started working in banking. So my first job was American National Bank as a credit analyst. But then baseball kept calling. Actually rehabbed pretty well. Next thing I know, I'm working out for a scout down in Florida with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Played 2 years of minor league baseball. But I was lucky because I had my degree. And even though my career was cut short, my shoulder didn't really cooperate, I was able to go back into banking, which is where I've been ever since. So I've been in banking almost 27 years now, almost all of that in Chicago. and almost all of that with JPMorgan, about 20 years with JPMorgan Chase. And almost exclusively in the middle market business. So again, I run our middle market business. I also am deeply engaged with our philanthropic and our corporate responsibility efforts in Chicago. I am very proud to say JPMorgan Chase is the largest corporate giver in Illinois. So what do we do with our dollars? There's 4 key focuses. Neighborhood revitalization. How do we build communities? So this is more purpose-driven, not profit-driven. So how do we use very sophisticated structures, new markets, tax credits, in order to build affordable housing? 2, workforce development. Everybody's heard about the skills gap and workforce issues. How do we help people get the skills they need in order just to get middle of the road kind of jobs? Get the basic skills to drive a forklift or be a welder. 3, financial health and wellness. How do we help individuals understand how to get into basic banking products? How to actually get a mortgage? How to have good financial health themselves? And then lastly, small business. So 2 key areas of making wealth in this country: housing and owning a business. So how do we help people start a business, scale a business, so on and so forth? Those are the 4 key pillars across our global philanthropy that we invest in. I'm heavily engaged in the community across those pillars. Several boards, I think of 5 or 6 different boards. I've been in nonprofit boards for years. I used to run our Arizona business, Arizona, Nevada. I was there for 3 years, 2014 to 2017, and deeply involved in the community, probably on 10 boards. So I am not what I think most people think of as a corporate, all about profit and how do I get more money. I am very purpose-driven, just like all of you in this room. We launched a racial equity commitment, the firm did, post George Floyd, a $30 billion commitment. I can talk about how it's tenfold, really any other corporation. That's all headline grabbing, but that's not really what's the important piece of that commitment. That commitment is about how do we help change what has been an issue in this country for a long time, wealth gap, particularly black and brown, and systemic racism. And what we woke up and said is that we've been a part of that system for a long time. So we need to be part of that change. And the only way you can do that is to acknowledge where you need to do better. And so I am deeply involved in this effort in order to hold ourselves accountable and being fully transparent in what we said we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So what is that commitment? It's largely, 90% of that $30 billion is largely about affordable housing. How do we get more mortgages? So for individuals buying mortgages, particularly black and brown, or buying homes, how do we make it easier for them to get mortgages? I don't have to tell you about the nasty history of redlining and all the different things. We've made it hard for people to get mortgages. How can we make it easier for people to get mortgages? How can we build more affordable housing? So we are literally building affordable housing across this country and also in the Chicagoland area. And how do we keep rents affordable? So of the $30 billion, $12 billion has already been spent. $12 billion of that is going to landlords, incenting them to keep their rents low and affordable. $90,000 homes so far, units, have been kept affordable through those efforts. Otherwise, people probably could not stay in those units. Here in the Chicagoland area, we made a $600 million commitment around housing. Over a 5-year period. How do we build, also maintain affordable housing for individuals? So that's a 5-year commitment. Philanthropically, here in Chicago, we have a total $200 million commitment, which started in 2017. It was re-upped in 2020 for a 5-year period for a total of $200 million that will be deployed across those 4 pillars that I mentioned. To date, after we launched in 2020 philanthropically, we've already deployed $110 million of that. So, though that's me in a nutshell, that's my background, that's what we're doing at JPMorgan Chase. I'd love now to talk about what are some things that maybe you guys can be thinking about as you think about the current state of what we're in, which I think is a moment in time. If you think about sort of post-George Floyd, I was about to say post-pandemic, I hope it's post, but this pandemic and what that's revealed in terms of need. And what are some things that you guys can be doing creatively in order to either supercharge your current model or re-examine it for what is the current need of today? So, a couple thoughts. Sounds really basic, but analysis of just the needs of your population and making sure that you're serving those needs through regular and direct engagement. Secondly, make sure that when you are looking at the areas that you're serving, understanding the systemic nature of that. So that there are probably other areas that you could potentially expand into because of the broader system, that the particular issue that you might be working on, there might be a whole system of issues. I'll give you a couple examples of that. It's not going to be that helpful if we really do a great job of changing how we deliver mortgages, we make it easier for people to get into mortgages, if their home does not appraise. There's a massive gap of appraisals between black and white individuals and white individuals. That whole industry needs to be reformed. So we're working on that through a public policy effort to reform that issue. So that's an example of systemic things that might be beyond the one particular area that you are focused on. I'll give you another example. There's an organization called Hope, it's fairly new, where they are, I think, doing a pretty fantastic thing, giving free college to students that need it. It's obviously very easy to understand. It's hard for many to get that dream if they can't afford it. And so giving scholarships. But they're taking it to another level, because I understand there's a systemic issue in that family unit. Perhaps not just taking care of that child going to college, but maybe the parents also need workforce help and assistance. So they're creating another offering to help the parents of those students. So you're creating a stability in the home, right? So just a few examples of thinking about systematic things that you're trying to address. And then doing analysis of your organization's role in the entire ecosystem, serving the populations that you serve. Are there ways that you can expand and work with other organizations? Sort of multiplier effect, so collaborate. I know that as an organization, the reason we went to the 4 pillars is because we used to do it like what a lot of corporates do, which was like spread the peanut butter. So, and it all depends on who's leading at the time. So someone might have a favorite museum, a favorite art, and I'm not saying anything against museums or whatever. I think there's a place to support the community broadly across a lot of things. But we decided we know what we're good at, and we're going to maximize our efforts into that. so that we can get the maximum need. And then on top of that, we're holding our grantees accountable to say, how can you do the same? If we're going to give you this money, how are you going to maximize those dollars because of your collaborative efforts with your partners? How are you growing your sphere of relationships? Some of these things I think, you're going to know right, pretty easy. Strive to make sure that your board is representative of the communities that you're serving. And I know this can be challenging. I'm told you I'm on a bunch of boards, and I know that's like usually number one on our governance list. How can we be more representative of the communities that we serve? That goes to intentionality. You guys are not in the business that you're doing if hard made you run and made you quit. It's about being intentional. Go beyond the inputs and evaluating the impact. So just don't, sometimes we get all caught up in the metrics, and go beyond that. Understand sort of the human element. Understand sort of the emotional side of it. I'm not suggesting data is not important. Absolutely. That's another actually thing I would suggest. If you're not measuring your outcomes and understanding how you are, or what you're holding yourself accountable to, it's hard to get there. But don't just let the numbers drive. We got it. We got to 50, that's what it... Really understand underneath that. What is that impact? And then lastly, think about your role in the narrative change. So it's always good to just pull up and ask yourself, what is the environment we're currently in? And where are we potentially going? And what is my part in that narrative? How can we change what we say in order to really fit with sort of the broader narrative at play and what's really needed, right? I mean, the best example of that is, I think, again, going back to the pandemic and some of the social unrest, I think it clearly opened up the differences that many communities faced today across a variety of things. Healthcare, financial, access. And so how can you sort of be part of that broader narrative of change? So I'll stop there. I'm going to try to leave some time for questions. I haven't been paying attention how long I've been talking, but I will leave you though with one thing that I've always followed in my life. So I talked a lot about my parents and my dad, and it's something that I think is applicable regardless of your race. But for me, it's something that I still cherish to this day, but I didn't fully understand when my dad first told me. But he told me at some point when I was young, he said, "Son, you have to be twice as good." And of course I said, why do I have to be twice as good? I'm just saying like everybody else. Why do I have to have that burden? And he further described it as, well, I'm just going to describe it like this. If you're in a race, and you run that race, and it looks like a tie, and the tie goes to the photo booth, you're going to lose that race every time. Because the photo booth is going to pick the other person. So, well, that's not fair. They should look at who actually won. He said, you have to win that race by so much that it cannot be a photo finish. That no one can take it from you. No one can make an excuse to say, well, but this, but that. You have to win it by that much. Never understood that. It wasn't until this was my second banking job. I was a pretty young banker, probably late 20s. All excited, I got this new job, and I was actually talking to the CEO of the bank, and he was like, yep, come on in, we'd love to have you. I met my direct manager maybe once in the process, but realized my direct manager really wasn't a part of that process. I was really hired by the CEO. So I went there, kept doing what I was always doing, working hard. 6 months later, my boss pulled me in an office and said, hey, I got some news for you. I said, what's that? He says, I'm leaving. I said, oh, sorry to hear that. He said, but I have to tell you something. I said, what? He said, when you walked into the bank and the CEO told me that you're going to be on my team. Now, mind you, this is the time I walked in, I was the only black person on the floor. He said, I was upset. I said, why? I thought this was kind of an experiment. You're going to have me take someone and I'm going to have to carry this person. Why me? I couldn't believe he was telling me that. But my mind went right to what my dad told me. Imagine if I was just mediocre, like most of the other people in there, average, and it went to the photo booth. What would the photo booth say to me? Because I can tell you, if he felt that way, how many other people felt that way when I walked in? The expectation was low. I had to win that race by double. Because what he told me was, not only did you come in and beat my expectations, you outworked most of the people on this floor. And that's when it really resonated with me, what my dad told me. And I've always lived by that. But like I said, you can use that principle in everything. And I continue to live that out today, and I teach my children the same thing. So I see I'm getting the hook, so.
Thank you, Curtis. I'm going to try and make my comment, but I feel a bit, just very touched by what you said. Also, Hinsdale Central grad, but I am with Salvation Army, and one of my jobs when I started was to build up our board. And George Floyd happened shortly after that, and I started doing my own searching. And I looked at our board, and it was mostly older white men. And I am happy to say, with talking about what can our roles be in the narrative change, not just looking for diversity in race, which was top of mind, but also gender and also socioeconomic status. Why did board members have to have a certain socioeconomic status? So I'm proud to say that 2 years later, we have a diverse board in all of those ways, and I just challenge everyone here to do the same. Maybe start small with something like your boards or subgroups and see if any change is needed and who else can have a seat at the table. So thank you. So many takeaways.
Love it. Others? Feedback, comments, thoughts, questions for Curtis? Okay. Could you talk a little bit more about how Chase Bank supports workforce development?
Sure. I actually think we should go a little bit broader than what we do, but we really focus on that sort of so think of post-high school, where you're not going to college, or maybe you went to community college, but you need a skill specific to get a job. That could be driving a truck, that could be, I mentioned the forklift, the welder. As someone that runs middle market business with companies, I have heard for decades that companies can't find enough skilled work. It isn't just because of the pandemic, it isn't because there's a economic slowdown. That has been the narrative for years. And so there's clearly a workforce issue in terms of this country, and I think a lot across the globe. And so we're very much focused on how do we support organizations that are helping people get that certificate or get that training or get, whatever it is, so they can walk out of that and actually get that job. I think we can go broader than that, but I'm not creating necessarily the model, but that's generally what our focus is.
I should also mention Curtis is a DuPage resident, lives right in Hinsdale with his family. Any other questions, comments?
Can you say a little bit more about the public policy on transforming the appraisal process? You mentioned.
Yeah, so that one.
Can everybody hear that question? Okay.
That one. So what we've found is like anything, right? If you don't have good representation within an organization or a company, you're probably not going to get the outcomes that you really would like to see. So if you look at the appraisal industry, and I don't want to offend any appraisers in here, so I just...
There are no appraisers in here.
But
you only have bleeding heart nonprofit people and higher ed people here.
I'm generalizing, but the vast majority of appraisers are older, mostly white. I mean, I think I saw a stat, it was like 90% white, and mostly generally age 50, 55, 65. Okay? So not a full surprise when you start looking at outcomes, and it isn't because not gonna say it's like an intentionality, as much as it is, again, if you're not representative of populations that you serve, you're going to have outcomes that aren't consistent with what's needed. And so there needs to be, a couple things. One, we need to get more people interested in the appraisal industry. It's going to age out. We don't have enough young people engaged in it, and definitely not enough diverse people within that industry. And so that is a systemic reform that needs to happen. There also needs to be some reform around specific how we are using comps, which it's not a science. There's some fingers on the scale that can be put there to sort of determine things. So that needs to be looked at and make sure there's complete fairness around how that's done. I mean, it's not hard to understand how some communities that are already depressed and disinvested, that the housing, getting appraised housing is going to be challenging, right? And so, but making sure that we have a fairness and we also have change in terms of the actual personnel, some of the things we're talking about.
Right up here, so I can. Yeah. That's okay. I'm getting my steps in. It's wonderful.
Hi, I'm from DuPage Habitat for Humanity. I'm the advocacy manager there. Shameless plug, we are trying to work with the city of Naperville to do affordable housing. And we need people to come to these council meetings. So if you're interested, keep an eye on. We need speakers, we need all kinds of. But
I think she has a real question.
I do have a real question. But HFHI at the international level put out advancing Black homeownership as one of their lead initiatives this fiscal year. And so I was just wondering, when we look at who we service, we also service the Chicago South Side suburbs.
Yeah.
Which I know has been extremely affected by redlining and segregation. So I guess, is there any way to partner with Chase Bank on financial literacy and offering those types of like inclusive classes to further advance an initiative like that?
Yeah, I'd love to. We should talk about it.
Oh no, now you've done it.
Oh boy, Curtis, what you just did times 130. You better, I hope you have all afternoon to shake hands.
Well, look,
no, that's good.
I mentioned up here collaboration and coordination. I see it all the time on all the boards I'm on where it's like, why aren't we working with this group? Why are we siloed? I talk with my banking partners, B of A and whoever, why aren't we thinking about creative ways to reach the community together? I know we're competitors, but that's okay. That stuff's important. You're not going to get change unless you have that.
See, I took a couple of things away from what Curtis said. First of all, what a remarkable journey in just a few generations in his family, right? From where his ancestry and history comes from to have this guy doing what he does today in his role today. I get inspired by stuff like that and meeting people like him. So thank you for sharing your personal journey. That's never easy to talk about personal stuff. Second, I want to underscore this point about collaboration. I know that we've heard this in these circles, right? But there are so many natural partnerships and collaborative partnerships that can happen in our community. And I know that Barb, I'm sure the DuPage Foundation values collaboration when they get applications. This is what funders are looking for. And so instead of seeing our industry as competitors vying for the same dollars, there's a lot to be said for collaboration and working together. And then the third thing I took away, and I told Curtis this too, that oh gosh, he just shared an example of a nonprofit that didn't think big enough when they were making their ask, right? Their thing was college scholarships for youth, and then Chase said, well, the systemic issue is really also empowering the parents of those youth. So how about we fund that too? The nonprofit didn't think big enough. They didn't think creatively enough. They didn't think about addressing the systemic issue at hand. So I think that's the kind of stuff I take away from what he's saying, that there are opportunities to think more creatively, more innovatively, more collaboratively, and really work, and that's the kind of stuff that Chase wants to support. Did I cap?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, hang on. I'm trucking in high heels. I'm trucking over to you, my friend. Trucking in high heels. We're here.
Thank you for your story, Curtis.
Oh, nobody can hear me. Sorry.
Megan with Trucking in High Heels. Thank you, Curtis, for your story. Being a woman in the trucking industry, it's a male-dominated field. Definitely a lot of rejection there. So my question to you, because our nonprofit is fairly new, how much of age does the not-for-profit have to be in order to build a relationship and or start a partnership with Chase? Two, we are empowering females and foster children, because I am a former foster child. We are empowering the foster child woman on how to forge a career in the trucking industry. So how do we begin that relationship? Because most times when we knock on doors, we're being told, who are you partnering with? Where's your collaboration? Because you're so young.
Right.
And it's a turn-away. But we offer a big service.
Yeah. Well, look, the one thing I know that we do is we are big on having our partners and grantees collaborate, and we will help do that. We'll try to connect and make relationships because we see the value. And that, I mentioned it before, scale matters. And that broadens the reach. And so in that instance, and I'd be happy to
Just being so careful.
to try to help with that. And again, it's about how can we help connect you with partners. I mean, it's building relationships. It's learning from others. It's thinking about what are funders really looking for, right? And sometimes that's hard to do on your own. You need to hear from others. And the thing I like about what we do is, again, we try to help companies understand how to actually develop a philanthropic strategy so that they can do it in a more targeted way. Again, that only helps the entire community. So anyway, I'd be happy to try to help, if I can.
All right, so we've done so well with keeping on time. If you need it, have